Hello and welcome to The Understudy, the channel that teaches you everything about musical theater. My name is Philippa, and today I will read from Broadway Musicals, The 101 Greatest Shows of All Time by Ken Bloom and Frank Blasnick. To get the full version of the book, I recommend getting the physical copy, as images and certain inserts from the book won't be displayed here. I do not own this material, I'm just reading from a place of entertainment and education, and I will not edit these audio recordings as I go, so you will get the unabridged version. Today, we will talk about Section F. Fanny opened November 4th, 1954 at the Majestic Theatre with 888 performances. Produced by David Merrick and Joshua Logan. Book by N.S. Berman and Joshua Logan. Music and lyrics by Harold Rome. Based on the films Marius, Fanny, and Caesar by Marcel Pagnol. Musical director Lehman Engel. Vocal arrangements by Lehman Engel. Music orchestrated by Philip J. Lang and musical continuity by Trude Rittman, directed by Joshua Logan, choreographed by Helen Tamiris, scenic design by Joe Meilsener, lighting design by Joe Meilsener, and costume design by Alvin Colt. Synopsis. Caesar, a cafe owner, and his best friend Panis, a merchant of maritime goods, watch Fanny, a waitress, and Marius, Caesar's son, grow into adulthood. Fanny is admired by both the seafaring wanderer Marius and his widower father Panis. Marius sleeps with Fanny on the eve of sailing off to the sea, and soon Fanny finds herself pregnant. Her virtue is saved by Panis, who agrees to marry her and call the son his own. When Marius returns from his voyage, he demands Fanny and his son return to him, but Caesar convinces Marius that he has no rights given his past actions. Besides, Panis has become a doting husband and father. Years later, Panis dies, and Caesar writes Marius to return to his family. Cast: Marius, William Tebert. Fanny, Florence Henderson. Panis, Walter Slezak. The Admiral, the Gerald Prince. Caesar, Ezio Pinza. Honorine, Edna Preston. Cesario, Lloyd Rees. Estarfique, Alan Carney. David Merrick made his musical comedy producing debut with Fanny, directed and co-authored by Joshua Logan. Because it was a delicate and unique piece, Logan's choice of Harold Rome to musicalize Marcel Pagnol's film trilogy was surprising. For up to this point in his career, Rome had specialized in giving voice to the feelings of American middle class. Here was an epic story that was decidedly French in both tone and feeling. Luckily, Rome was more than up to the challenge. As is often with the story of theater, Fanny had to undergo various trials before it would open on Broadway, and it's a great tribute to David Merrick's tenacity that the show ever opened at all. Merrick had only produced 3 plays up to this point, and none was a hit. Indeed, he was still a relatively unknown on Broadway. When Merrick initially sent Marcel Pagnol a series of missives asking him the rights to his trilogy, they were all ignored. Undeterred, Merrick hopped on a plane and knocked on Pagnol's door, and the surprise playwright invited Merrick in and soon agreed to let his works become the basis for an American musical. With the rights finally sewn up, Merrick had only to find an artistic staff. He first hired playwrights Albert Hackett and Francis Goodrich, who wanted to reset the piece in New England. But after 3 unproductive years with the Hacketts, Merrick decided on Joshua Logan, who agreed to undertake the writing and direction if he could also have co-producer credit. Logan, in return, brought in sophisticated playwright S.N. Berman as a collaborator on the libretto. Having teamed fairly happily with Rodgers and Hammerstein on South Pacific, Logan also immediately offered the task of the score to the famous team. They were very interested, but as they insisted with all their shows, they also wanted to produce. Their lawyers drew up an agreement which read, Rodgers and Hammerstein present Fanny, with Merrick's name nowhere to be seen. As this was his first venture into presenting musical comedy, Merrick was more than willing to second billing to the masters. Indeed, he only wanted a line below the title to read in association with David Merrick. But Rodgers and Hammerstein, not the most amenable amenable of businessmen refused, and David decided to do it alone. Given Merrick's temperament, it's difficult to see him collaborating with anyone, but as the good lawyer he was, he realized the benefits of such a partnership. Logan claims in his autobiography that for the rest of his life, Hammerstein regretted not writing Fanny. At the time, Logan was working with Rome on the Catskills musical comedy, Wish You Were Here, and the writer-director admired Rome's skill in composing the seemingly simple songs that expressed very deep emotions, exactly what was required for the characters in Fanny. Merrick wanted Alan J. Lerner and Burton Lane, who then were under contract to MGM. Lane worked out a release from the Hollywood contract, so in love was he with Fanny. But Logan refused to work with anyone with whom he had not already collaborated, ensuring that Rome would be hired. Rome's score is extremely unusual, difficult to grasp on first hearing, but its richness is all the more surprising given its apparent simplicity. It is probably unsurpassed in the American theater. To be sure, there is the soaring title song, which became a standard, but the score also contains many unique, almost obtuse songs, like the Octopus Song, unlike any other written for a Broadway show. Here is a score that is unconcerned with selling itself to the audience. In screaming its importance across the footlights, be kind to your parents, to my wife, never too late for love, and love is a very light thing, are sweet, effortless, yet deeply felt tributes to the basic humanity of the show's characters. By understating its themes, both musically and lyrically, Rome's tender, meaningful score becomes the all more profound. A note must also be made that Philip J. Lang's unobtrusive, supportive orchestrations for both Rome and Lang eschewed the typical Broadway idea of a French settings. No accordions, no Piaf-like walls, no sexy rose and boulevardiers. The honesty of Fanny in writing, performance, and production probably threw some critics in 1954, who gave it only kind reviews. In retrospect, it has turned out to be one of the hallmarks of the American musical theater, awaiting a major revival. Florence Henderson. Known to whole generations as Mrs. Brady, Florence Henderson had a whole career as a successful Broadway star in the 1950s and 60s, after an early break in the ensemble Wish You Were Here, where she briefly fellow up-and-comer Phyllis Newman. They banded together since the rest of the chorus ignored them, and worse. She went on tour for a year as Laurie in the National Company of Oklahoma. While out on the road, she auditioned for Wish You Were Here director Josh Logan, then casting the ingenue lead of his upcoming musical, Fanny. Only 20 and sharing the stage with such heavyweights as Ezio Pinza and Walter Slezak, Henderson captivated audiences and critics with her simple, Indiana-bred innocence and vibrant soprano of near-operatic proportions. Inexhaustible, she spent the remainder of the decade starting a family and was constantly presence on television, appearing on variety shows, often with fellow Roger Hammerstein stalwart Big Hales, and the first female co-host of The Today Show. The 1960s brought a reunion with her guardian angel, Richard Rogers. He so respected her that she was one of the few females in his employ that he never made a pass at. Playing Maria in The Sound of Music. Had her next Broadway vehicle, The Girl Who Came to Supper, been a hit, perhaps he would have never lost her to an extended stay in La La Land. Co-starring Jose Ferrer, an actor at the bottom of everyone's list to play a handsome, dashing prince in a musical, its failure wasn't remotely her fault, for Henderson mined everything where there was to be had out of Noel Coward's score, and knocked her show-stopping 7-minute encapsulation of an entire Broadway operetta, The Coconut Girl, clear out of the park. But after a well-received South Pacific at Lincoln Center, Henderson became the mother of 3 very lovely girls, and in spite of rumors that she'd replace Liv Ullmann in Rogers' finale musical I Remember Mama, Henderson has never returned to the New York stage. Harold Rome outputs may not match that of his contemporaries in quantity, but the quality and success of his shows put him near the top of the list of major Broadway songwriters. He contributed both words and music to a variety of shows, spanning a wide range, from the Old West of Destry Rides Again to the New York garment district of I Can Get It For You Wholesale, to the Old South Gone with the Wind. Like many other songwriters, Rome studied law, but the stock market crash forever changed his fortune, or previous lack thereof. His big break came in 1937 when Rome was hired by the International Ladies Garment Workers Union to write songs for a topical review, Pins and Needles, to be performed entirely by members of the union. Intended as a limited run for a few weeks, it was so successful that the show was extended and ran over 1,000 performances, a remarkable achievement and testament to Rome's developing talents. An ardent liberal, Rome continued in a topical satirical vein in his next shows, Sing Out the News, 1938, which contained the hit song Franklin D. Roosevelt Jones, and Call Me Mister, 1946, with the hit South America, Take It Away. The high-spirited, lovable Wish You Were Here, 1952, followed with its romantic title song and renowned onstage swimming pool. Fanny was a resounding hit, and Rome's good fortune continued with the rare musical odor Destry Rides Again in 1959. Less successful commercially was I Can Get It For You Wholesale, which introduced Barbra Streisand not only to the world at large, but to co-star Elliot Gould, who'd marry her. In a career that exemplified diversity of subject matter, Rome's final Broadway production was perhaps his most diverse. In 1965's The Zulu and Zeta, and while it only ran 179 performances, the score was Rome at its best. Commissioned to write a musical version of Gone with the Wind for a Japanese theater, the result, Scarlet, soon found its way to a spectacular production in London as Gone with the Wind and the pre-Broadway tour that never came into New York. One of the premier collectors of African art, Rome was a true mensch, loved by all who knew and worked with him. Backstage. When Variety was unable to get grosses from Merrick, he wrote the paper, whenever the average high temperature from the preceding week is 63 degrees or less, the gross for Fanny is 63,000. Thereafter, the gross recedes in inverse ratio to the rise of the average high temperatures of the week. When Florence Henderson left the cast, Merrick cast his current girlfriend in the role. Fiddler on the Roof opened September 22, 1964 at the Imperial Theatre with 3,242 performances. Produced by Harold Prince, book by Joseph Stein, music by Jerry Bach, lyrics by Sheldon Harnick, based on stories by Shalom Alchemai. Music orchestrated by Don Walker, music director Milton Green, vocal arrangements by Milton Green, dance arrangements by Betty Wahlberg, directed by Jerome Robbins and choreographed by Jerome Robbins, scenic design by Boris Aronson, costume design by Patricia Siprot, lighting design by Jean Rosenthal. Synopsis. Tevye is the poor dairyman of Anatevka, a shlet in Tsarist Russia. He and his wife, Golde, have 5 daughters, and they will live their lives according to their traditions. Those traditions are questioned by the oldest daughter, Zaitzel, who wants to marry a poor tailor whom she loves, rather than the elderly butcher Lazar Wolf, to whom she was promised in marriage by Tevye. Tevye's father is tested again when his second daughter, Hodel, marries a young revolutionary who is arrested and sent to Siberia. The ultimate challenge comes when Tevye's third daughter, Chava, wants to marry a young, handsome Russian boy who is not Jewish. This Tevye cannot condone. Soon the citizens of Anatevka are commanded to leave their homes. Resigned to their fate, Tevye, Golde, and the 2 remaining daughters set off with their friends for a new life far from the home they love. Cast: Tevye, Zero Mostel; Golde, Maria Karnilova; Zaitzel, Joanna Merlin; Hodel, Julia Magenis; Chava, Tanya Everett. Gente, Beatrice Arthur. Motel, Austin Pendleton. Perchik, Bert Convey. Lazar Wolf, Michael Granger. Rabbi, Gluck Sander. At this writing, a new production of Fiddler on the Roof has opened to the decidedly mixed reviews. This revival boasts an reimagining, what is now known as a revisal. Now, we're not asking for a slavish recreation of the original production. That would be impossible. And while we can't imagine any staging better than Jerome Robbins' original work, it would be fine with us if another young, talented director-choreographer gave it a shot. Trouble is, there don't seem to be any young director-choreographers who have proven themselves as gifted at as Robbins. If you can't prove it, why change it? The producers of this new Fiddler were obviously inspired by the immensely successful revival of Chicago and revival of Cabaret. To be sure, these productions caught the public's imagination, but the old fogies who saw the originals know that something palpable was missing in the remountings. Chicago substituted Victoria's Secret's titillation and dramaturgic shorthand for the rich, imaginative vaudeville concept of the original production. Without any sets or costumes to speak of, and with the orchestra on stage level, this revival of Chicago, successful though it is, isn't really truly a Broadway show. This certainly isn't a new phenomenon. For as the eminent critic George Jean Nathan wrote in New York Journal American on Sunday, May 25, 1952, operating under the delusion increasingly noticeable among our producers that if theatergoers loved a show when they first saw it, they will not love it any longer unless all sorts of alterations are made to it. The present sponsors monkey-eye the revival of any public acceptance and right into the can. In their zeal to bring shows up to date, the producers succeed not only in diminishing their original values, but in making them even more out of date. Thus, squirting the Stas and Gags, Truman sports shirts, and into the icing from far from acceptable modernizing it, only makes it an audience doubly conscious of its age. It's as artificially colored hair and face enamel accentuates a woman's, and thus, when about a dozen years ago its producers sought to liven up The Merry Widow by inserting a banana-eating comedian, not only did the murder the excellent operetta chances on the spot, but caused the people seeing and hearing it for the first time seriously to doubt whether it had ever been what earlier audiences properly appreciated it was. And it's not only monkeying with the tone, it's the overhauling of the scripts, muddying the intent of the original book to the point where something that would have seemed nostalgic or slightly creaky is now nonsensical. Would a modern day producer get away with rewriting Death of a Salesman or The Glass Menagerie? Why are musicals less sacrosanct? Our current writer complained that the original, still living authors of a classical musical, on most people's 10 best list, balked at his making too many changes to the book. One would assume that if theater company wanted to rework one of his plays, he'd hit the roof. Isn't it hubris to think that a playwright with one or two successful off-Broadway plays knows better than George Abbott, Joseph Fields, or Jerome Chodorov, with all many successes and decades in the theater on the resumes? Why is it generally assumed that Pal Joey, Finian's Rainbow, or The Boys from Syracuse need rewrites? And what exactly was wrong with the original books? Their 1982 revival of Little Me, one of the funniest books ever, reimagined the tour de force role originally played by Sid Caesar into a split between actors, James Coco and Victor Garber, both wonderful actors, by the way. Why? The problem, it seems to us, is that the producers, estates, and writers don't trust the material. If you don't trust it, why produce the show in the first place? The creators of the original Fiddler, Joseph Stein, Jerry Bach, and Sheldon Harnick, all under brilliantly watchful eye of Jerome Robbins, never lost faith or confidence in the raw material with which they were presented. During rehearsals, once the theme of the show, tradition, was established, Jerome Robbins was adamant that every moment exemplify or illuminate that theme. He wanted to show with no extraneous material. Stein, Bach, and Harnick managed to give Robbins what he wanted while keeping a wonderful sense of character and warmth to the proceedings. Fiddler is a show that was as much conceptual show as Sondheim's Company or Follies, but utilized a more traditional structure. And that is why many people feel that Fiddler is the greatest musical of all time. Zero Mostel. Zero Mostel began his career as sketch comedian in such reviews as Keep 'em Laughing and Concert Varieties, and played an early supporting role in the Alfred Drake flop Beggar's Holiday. Although he received much acclaim for his dramatic turns in Eugene Ionesco's Rhinoceros and James Joyce's Ulysses in Nighttown, Mostels will always be remembered for creating the role of Max Bialystock from the movie The Producers, as well as for his two starring roles in musicals. First as the slave in A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, and then as Tevye in the old long-running Fiddler on the Roof, creating, when the spirit moved him, 5 of the most thrilling minutes of Broadway history with his soliloquy, If I Were a Rich Man. After the surprise hit movie The Producers failed to bring the swarms of offers he had hoped for, he realized he had 2 roles of his lifetime in Pseudolus and Tevye the Milkman. And he continued to play both parts in subsequent productions. Unfortunately, his complicated psyche and monumental ego led him to play extremely fast and loose with the text, much to the frustration of his co-star and charge of the author, who were understandably nonplussed with Mostel's liberties. His antics were perhaps more forgivable by Larry Gelman and Bert Shelavilov's burlesque of the works of Plautus, but was absolutely disgraceful to ad-lib about Jimmy Carter from a turn-of-the-century Russian schlitz. And Sheldon Harnick. Composer Jerry Bock began his career as co-author of the Sammy Davis Jr. vehicle Mr. Wonderful, while lyricist Sheldon Harnick began writing specialty for material for reviews. Most notably, Boston Begin for New Faces of 52 and Merry Little Minette for John Murray Anderson's Almanac. After teaming up with and producing early flop The Body Beautiful, they auditioned and were given a huge break writing a show for director George Abbott. The result, Fiorello, won both the Tony Award and the Pulitzer Prize, a monumental feat for such young, relatively new writers. Its score revealed a great flair for writing specific and unique character songs. After a post-Fiorello flop, Tenderloin, they wrote She Loves Me, Fiddler on the Roof, and The Apple Tree in 3 years, showing an incredible versatility. Highly in demand, twice they doctored scores for troubled shows, adding songs to Baker Street, 4 songs, and Her First Roman, 3 songs. After providing a wonderful score for the Rothschilds, they ended their 15-year partnership. Harnick to team up with Richard Rodgers on Rex and with Mitchell Legrand on musicalization of A Christmas Carol and a stage version of The Umbrella at Cherbourg, while Bach kept a very low profile, his attempts at new scores going unproduced. At the early end to their collaboration was a great loss, for in songs like The Very Next Man from Fiorello, Tonight at 8 and from She Loves Me, and Oh, to Be a Movie Star from The Apple Tree were exhibited talent of the highest order. Backstage, Danny Kaye, Tom Bosley, Danny Thomas, Alan King, and Howard Da Silva were all considered for the role of Tevye. Nancy Walker, Kay Ballard, and Kid Mefford were all considered for Golde. Charles Durning played the village priest in Fiddler, but his part was whittled away while the show played Detroit and Washington, and he never opened with the show in New York. Finian's Rainbow opened January 10, 1947 at the 46th Street Theater with 725 performances. Produced by Lee Stephenson and William R. Katzel. Book by E.Y. Harburg and Fred Sadie. Music by Burton Lane. Lyrics by E.Y. Harburg. Music orchestrated by Robert Russell Bennett and Don Walker. Musical director Milton Rosenstock. Vocal arrangements by Lynn Murray. Dance arrangements by Trude Whitman. Assistant vocal arrangements by Ray Charles. Directed by Brittain Windust. Choreographed by Michael Kidd. Scenic design by Joe Meisner. Costume design by Eleanor Goldsmith. Lighting design by Joe Meisner. Synopsis. Irishman Finian McLonergan has stolen a crock of gold from the leprechaun Og. Finian brings the gold and his daughter Sharon to Rainbow Valley, Mississippi. For Finian believes that if the United States can get rich by burying its gold in Fort Knox, so can he. Og has followed his stolen gold and fallen head over heels for Sharon, but she only has eyes for Woody Mahoney, a union organizer of the local sharecroppers. Woody's sister, Susan the Silent, is the only person other than Finian who knows the location of the gold, but she's mute, able to communicate only through dance. A subplot features the racist Senator Billboard Rockins, who is trying to subvert Woody's plans and buy up Rainbow Valley for himself. When Sharon unwittingly makes a wish while standing over the buried pot of gold, she turns Senator Rockins into a black man, setting in motion a firestorm of hijinks and ironies. Cast: Susan Mahoney, Anita Alvarez, Finian McLonergan, Albert Sharp, Sharon McLonergan, Ella Logan, Woody Mahoney, Donald Richards. Og, David Wayne, Senator Billboard Rockins, Robert Pitkin. The general rule on Broadway is that the more chances out of town, the more songs are put in and discarded, the smaller the chance that the show will be a success in New York. Breakfast at Tiffany's, Sail Away, Seesaw, Big, Victor Victoria, La Strada all underwent drastic changes. With characters axed, the new scenes and songs were written. Of course, there are exceptions. Both Funny Girl and Hello Dolly had severe troubles on the road. Many songs were added to and subtracted from Funny Girl, and director Garson Cannon was all but replaced by Jerome Robbins. Hello Dolly endured major recasting between Detroit and New York, and songs and sequences were eliminated. Still, the biggest hits remained pretty stable during the tryout period. Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein shows seemed to fare the best. Oklahoma had but one major change, its title. It opened in New Haven as Away We Go. There's a very rare sheet music out there with still that title. Otherwise, only one song, Boys and Girls Like You and Me, was deleted. Carousel suffered hardly any changes, and South Pacific had 3 songs eliminated out of town: Loneliness of the Evening, Now Is the Time, and My Girl Back Home. One of the finest shows in the 1940s was Finian's Rainbow, and it too underwent very few changes. Only one song was dropped. The reason Finian didn't change is unusual. On the first day of rehearsal, as composer Burton Lane ran the chorus through their parts, lyricist and co-librettist E.Y. Harburg came into the room and told the ensemble cast, "Don't listen to him. He's just the piano player." Lane left the room fuming and didn't speak to Harburg again until long after the show opened on Broadway. Luckily, the team had done their work well, and what appeared on the stage of the 46th Street Theater was, with the exception of one song cut on the road, exactly what went into rehearsal. The plot of Finian is a fantasy involving a leprechaun and a hidden plot of gold, but behind all the fantasy is a strong social statement. In the middle of the story, the bigoted Southern senator is turned black. In one famous story, Finian was being performed in a theater in the round. Each night, the actor playing the senator would race up the aisle where a stagehand would apply blackface on him to quickly run back down to the stage having been transformed. At one performance, an audience member chose exactly that moment to go up on the aisle. Imagine his surprise to find himself slapped with black makeup. An ironic twist, Finian has gotten the reputation over time. by people who have never actually seen it, of being a racist show. Nothing, of course, could be further from the truth. Harburg and Lane were dyed-in-the-wool liberals, with Harburg constantly preaching for the common man and Lane on Nixon's enemies list. So, today, when Finian's Rainbow and its exceptional score are most needed, it sadly isn't performed much. A contributing factor is the original cast recording that, because of its poor fidelity, doesn't do the score justice. A recent attempt at a Broadway mounting closed in Cleveland. Whimsy, fantasy, and social consciousness are a delicate balance. The film version, directed by Francis Ford Coppola of all people, wasn't a hit but was extremely faithful to the musical, boasting Fred Astaire in his last musical film role. And in the manner of many film musicals that were lambasted upon the first release, Hello Dolly and Star come to mind, it isn't bad in retrospect. Well, not so bad. Burton Lane. Burton Lane's career wasn't as long or wide-ranging as some of his contemporaries, but his work was consistently excellent, possessing an especially good sense of rhythm and depth of melody. Lane wrote the score to a Schubert show at the age of 14. It closed out of town, but had it come to New York, Lane would have been the youngest Broadway composer in history. With George Gershwin mentoring the youngster, he finally made it to Broadway, writing in collaboration with Howard Dietz for the revue Three's a Crowd, 1930. While Lane's career was mainly spent in Hollywood, he made occasional forays on Broadway. He tried again and again to find Broadway projects, but had rocky professional relationships with his main collaborators. E.Y. Harburg, with whom he shared a wonderful non-working relationship, as well as an unabashed liberalism, and Alan J. Lerner. His scores for Finian's Rainbow and On a Clear Day You Can See Forever are among the finest in Broadway history. Thanks to his lush melodies for such songs as How Are Things in Glockamora, She Wasn't You, and It's Time for a Love Song from his last score, Carmelina. Many projects, including an Upstairs Downstairs musical with Sheldon Harnick, never saw production. But the scores that were produced demonstrate an excellence that has seldom been equaled. David Wayne. David Wayne, like fellow character actor Eddie Albert, enjoyed a busy career in all media, jumping easily from theater to film to television and back again. After beginning his musical career with the flop Park Avenue, he really cleaned up in his second show, where his puckish whimsy as Og, the leprechaun in Finian's Rainbow, was awarded a Tony and 2 Donaldson Awards for Best Supporting Actor and Performance of the Year. After film triumphs, Adam's Rib and The Tender Trap, and straight play successes, Tea House of the August Moon, he returned to Broadway in the musical satire Say, Darling, followed by The Yearling, one of those disasters that performed its opening night with the closing night already posted. He immediately went into the music theater of Lincoln Center revival of Showboat, playing at a jaunty Cap'n Andy, followed by his best musical role since Finian's Rainbow, the warm and wise Grand Père in The Happy Time, charming audiences with The Life of the Party and A Certain Girl. Backstage. Finian's Rainbow is the favorite musical Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic. It has been performed there in a series of productions for almost 50 years. Composer Burton Lane almost became the youngest composer on Broadway. At age 14, he was discovered by a scout for the Schubert brothers. J.J. Schubert hired Lane to write songs for a new revue. The show wasn't produced because its star became ill, but later, in Atlantic City, Lane and his father heard his tunes in another Schubert show, with credit going to Schubert contract writer Maury Rubens. Lane's father threatened to sue, and the songs were deleted from the score. Fiorello opened November 23, 1959 at the Broadhurst Theatre with 796 performances. Produced by Robert E. Griffith and Harold S. Prince. Book by Jerome Weidman and George Abbott. Music by Jerry Bach. Lyrics by Sheldon Harnick. Musical director Hal Hastings. Music orchestrated by Irving Kostal. Dance arrangements by Jack Elliott. Directed by George Abbott. Choreographed by Peter Gennaro. Scenic design by William and Jean Eckert. Costume design by William and Jean Eckert. And lighting design by William and Jean Eckert. Synopsis. The story of firebrand Fiorello LaGuardia, a hero of World War I, reformed congressman from New York, and eventually its mayor. Set against his political life, Fiorello also tells the story of the loves of his life, his first wife, Thea, and his secretary and eventually second wife, Marie. Cast. Fiorello LaGuardia, Tom Bosley. Ben Marino, Howard Da Silva. Floyd, Mark Dawson. Morris, Nathaniel Frey. Thea, Ellen Hanley. Dora, Pat Stanley. Marie, Patricia Wilson. Neil, Bob Holliday. Fourth player, Ron Husman. Mitzi Travers, Eileen Rogers. Ed Peterson, Stanley Simmons. Fiorello LaGuardia standby, Harvey Lembeck. One would think that biographical musicals would occupy a larger portion of musical theater history than they do. After all, biography works in the movies, for the characters and the plot are right there in the history books. Why can't musicals do that? Do what the movies do and ignore the facts completely? There have been more than a few musical bios, but few has succeeded. There was Onward Victoria, the drab, dull life, in its creator's hands at least, of Victoria Woodhull. The first, the story of Jackie Robinson, and not the first show to start previews strongly and end up lousy by opening night. The Fireband of Florence, which examined episodes in the life of Benvenuto Cellini to a beguiling Kurt Weill and Ira Gershwin score. Ben Franklin in Paris, which wasn't as bad as history, recounts. Sophie, Stephen Allen's attempt at an even more Jewish funny girl. Ain't Broadway Grand, one of two musicals with Gypsy Rose Lee as a character. And finally, Keane, the story of actor Edmund Keane with an underappreciated score. So that leaves us with Fiorello, The King and I, Annie Get Your Gun, Gypsy, The Sound of Music, Evita, The Unsinkable Molly Brown, Wonderful Town. Yes, the Sherwood sisters were based on real people. And Funny Girl, the exceptions to the rule. With the exception of the first, which started as a hit and ended up as a double play, the flops all deal with people of higher standing than your average Broadway theater goer. At this writing, there is The Boy from Oz. Fiorello succeeded brilliantly due in no small part to the reality-infused acting, director George Abbott no-nonsense directing, the warm-hearted libretto and score, and the fact that Fiorello LaGuardia was still fondly remembered by a theater-going public. They loved him in life, and they loved him as embodied by Tom Bosley, making his Broadway debut. Pat Stanley, a gamine dancer actress with a charming singing voice who was a quirky potential successor to Carol Haney, made her debut in a small role in the Dolores Grey-John Raitt flop Carnival in Flanders. After playing Haney's role in the national tour of The Pajama Game, she had an incredibly busy 2-year period, playing Carrie Pipperidge in a city center production of Carousel with Barbara Cook and Howard Keel. Followed by 1-2 punch in Goldilocks, winning a Tony Award for her performance of Lady in Waiting and The Pussyfoot, and Fiorello, where she stopped the show with I Love a Cop. After a non-musical role in the comedy Sunday in New York, she disappeared into her marriage, resurfacing 20 years later for a brief 2-week run in the Godspeed Opera House transfer of The 5 O'Clock Girl. But, like so many others, she found Broadway had changed and there was no longer a place for her charming, winsome simplicity. Robert E. Griffith, great gentleman of the theater who teamed with the younger, super-energetic Hal Prince to produce many successful shows of the 1950s and 60s, started out as a performer, segueing into assistant director and stage manager on many of George Abbott's musicals of the 1940s, including Call Me Madam, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and Wonderful Town. His first show as producer was The Pajama Game, followed by other smashes including Damn Yankees, West Side Story, and Fiorello. His commitment to excellence and creative savvy are sorely lacking in the vast majority of today's producers. He died in 1961 at the age of 54. But his taste and unerring belief in talent lives on through his remarkable protege, Hal Prince. Backstage. When Tom Bosley performed in the revival of Fiorello in 1980s, instead of having to whiten his hair for the second act, he had to blacken his hair for the first act. Though he played the title role, Tom Bosley won the Tony Award for Featured Actor. Just another example of the craziness of the Tony Awards. Follies opened April 4th, 1971 at the Winter Garden Theatre with 522 performances. Produced by Harold Prince, book by James Goldman, music and lyrics by Stephen Sondheim, musical director Harold Hastings, music orchestrated by Jonathan Tunick, dance arrangements by John Berkman, choral arrangements by Harold Hastings, directed by Harold Prince and Michael Bennett, choreographed by Michael Bennett, scenic design by Boris Aronson, costume design by Florence Klotz, lighting design by Theron Musser. Synopsis. A reunion of members of the Wiseman Follies brings together many generations of performers who appeared on the stage of the Wiseman Theatre. Against the backdrop of their past, two couples in particular, Ben and Phyllis, smart, sophisticated intellectuals, and Buddy and Sally, subordinates, find themselves confronting their feelings as well as their pasts. As the Follies, performers and their ghosts perform in their old numbers, Ben, Phyllis, Buddy, and Sally revisit their past lives, which were filled with hope for the future. But they can't avoid confronting the stark reality of their current lives and relationships. The end of Follies finds the principals in a combined nervous breakdown as played out behind the veil of an actual Follies performance. Cast: Sally Durant, Dorothy Collins; Young Sally, Marty Rolfe; Christine Crane, Ethel Barrymore Colt; Stella Deems, Mary McCarthy; Heidi Schiller, Justine Johnson; Roscoe, Michael Bartlett; Hattie Walker, Ethel Shuda; Solange Lafitte, Fifi D'Orsay; Carlotta Campion, Yvonne DiCarlo; Phyllis Rogers Stone, Alexis Smith; Benjamin Stone, John McMartin; Young Phyllis, Virginia Sandifer; Young Ben, Kurt Peterson; Buddy Plummer, Gene Nelson; Young Buddy, Harvey Evans; Dimitri Weissman, Arnold Moss; Young Heidi, Victoria Mallory. Is Follies the greatest musical comedy of all time? Some would insist that it is. Maybe it was simply the greatest production of all time. For avid theatergoers, one viewing of Follies was not enough. It's a sure bet that whatever audiences found their way into the Winter Garden Theatre, a good percentage were repeat visitors. Still, it might also be argued that an equal number walked out or left the theater utterly perplexed by the show, and perhaps no other Broadway musical has so divided an audience. Nary a man is now alive who saw the original Showboat or Ziegfeld Follies or even Oklahoma, so we can't speak firsthand of their greatness. We have to take it on blind faith that Helen Morgan, perched on an upright piano, made people's hearts stand still when she extolled the virtues of Bill. We have to believe that there was no funnier than Fanny Brice singing "Becky is Back at the Ballet," or more touching than when she lamented her life with "My Man." People who were around from the 1950s on speak of some of the greatest moments in their theatrical history, high points of their years of theater going. Moments that caused the heart to leap or break, moments that stayed in their memories forever. They are the reason we return again and again to theater, hoping for new revelations of performance, stagecraft, or writing. Elaine Stritch escorting everybody rise in The Ladies Who Lunch. A ragdoll like Michael Jeter kicking higher and higher in a Charleston of giddy abandon in Grand Hotel. Mary Martin bursting through the darling's nursery window for the first time. Jennifer Holliday soul-bearing intensity in I Am Telling You I'm Not Going. It's the rare show that contains even one such moment. But those who venerate the original Follies can name many such breathtaking incidents on stage. Ethel Shudda kicking her imaginary cat while belting out Broadway Baby. Yvonne DiCarlo joyfully seeing it all in I'm Still Here. On the rare occasion, she didn't blow the lyrics. The harrowing in Buddy's eyes with the poignant simplicity of Losing My Mind, as sung by Dorothy Collins and staged by Bob Avian. Alexis Smith's exquisite Saulnier timing in Could I Leave You, only to be topped by her leggy song and dance turn in The Ballet of Lucy and Jessie. John Martin's horrific epiphany, Me, I've Got to Love Me. G. Nelson's superhuman swinging around the poles in The Right Girl, which Michael Bennett apparently hated. No, it was sheer magic. The ghosts gliding along the stage, existing in both past and present. Jonathan Tunick's ethereal, otherworldly orchestration of the overture. Florence Clott's astounding Loveland showgirl costumes. The subtextual brilliance of Michael Bennett's choreography for Who's That Woman? And most impressively, the shocking transition to Loveland, when the emotions swelled to such proportions that time and space seemed to explode into the Follies. Boris Aronson's dark, open setting transformed into the bright fairy tale world of Loveland, with Doyle drops plunging onto the stage and everything exploding into a visual and oral orgasm of musical theater bliss. Follies is a celebration of our past and our present, as well as an admonition. In our time, there can never be another Follies, just like there can never be another Showboat, another South Pacific, another Hair. All great shows are written in tune with the social, historical, and psychological pulse of their time. Oklahoma was a big hit partly because the world was at war and America needed to be reminded of its noble, yes, noble roots. The sets were mainly painted drops, since lumber was hard to get because of war shortages, and audiences were conditioned to show openings with a chorus of girls, not a soul cowboy singing from the wings about what a beautiful morning it was. Oklahoma was a product of its time and another place in history as much as Merry Widow or This Is the Army, where, though all great art is defined by universality and timelessness. No matter how successful they are in mounting revivals, they can never be as earth-shaking as the originals. This isn't to say we shouldn't continue to try, and the theaters should keep trying to replicate the magic moments of Follies. But if ever a show was of its time and place, Follies is it. A show about resonance, memory, and the regret of the road you didn't take. It requires attention, an opening of the heart and mind, and a great deal of intelligence and sensitivity. Harold Prince and Michael Bennett's direction and staging were layered in the countless ways, and the original cast can never be equaled. For not only was the show beautifully tailored to their specific talents, but fewer and fewer performances today have lived the history of those in Follies, a show all about histories. So, while we can't definitively say definitively that Follies is the greatest shows of all our 101 shows, either in writing or production, we can state unequivocally that its like will never be seen again, and that is the glory and tragedy of theater. It is at once the most accessible yet most ephemeral of arts. Havery Evans, a true legend. Although most people outside the Times Square won't be familiar with his name, Harvey Evans is one of the most beloved and gainfully employed, and did we say beloved, performers in Broadway history. Appearing in 28 Broadway musicals and national tours over the last 50 years, Evans began his career as Harvey Honecker, all of 16 and a featured dancer with the legendary Gwen Verdon in New Girl in Town. His resume includes the cream of show business of the latter half of the 20th century. Gypsy, West Side Story, also appearing in the film. Hello Dolly, Anyone Can Whistle, backing up another legend, Angela Lansbury. George M., The Boyfriend, where he Charles stoned to fare thee well with Sandy Duncan. And as young Buddy in another monumental show, The Follies. In between, he danced with Judy Garland on her television show, was a chimney sweep in the film Mary Poppins, and starred opposite Anne Margaret in the television production of Dames at Sea. With later roles as Jim Dale's standby in Barnum, a funny, touching Alban in the national tour of La Cage of Fall, opposite longtime friend Larry Kurt, and on and on and on. Harvey Evans was most recently seen in the 2002 revival of Oklahoma, as sunny and beloved as the 16-year-old Harvey Honecker was in 1957. Alexis Smith. Like Robert Preston and Angela Lansbury, classy, leggy Alexis Smith came to musicals after a long Hollywood career as a film actress. At the time, semi-retired, she auditioned unsuccessfully for Follies. But after buckling down and working with vocal coach David Craig, husband of Nancy Walker, on every note and gesture of her audition, she campaigned for another shot. This time, she nailed it and received unparalleled love letters from critics and a Tony Award for her performance as Phyllis Rogers Stone, the brittle sophisticate with a wide-eyed Corinne still buried somewhere in the icy surface. She returned to Broadway in 1979 in a really lousy show, Platinum, albeit with 6 minutes of sheer brilliance, when Smith's character, in a Follies-esque moment, looked back on her Hollywood career in the tour de force Nothing But, a song so head and shoulders above the rest of the score that Wags wondered if John Kander and Fred Ebb had written it on the sly. A national tour in the best little whorehouse in Texas followed, and for a while rumors flew that she would return in a full-fledged Broadway revival of Pal Joey. She played the hell of it on stock opposite a far too old Joel Grey. But another great Broadway turn never materialized. Backstage, Capitol Records wouldn't record a complete original cast recording of Follies. Damn them. Among the unlikely celebrities who have appeared in stock productions of Follies are such notables as Maxine Andrews, Ima Sumac, Dorothy Lamour, the incomparable Hildegard, and in a recent Los Angeles production, The Phyllis and Sally of Patty Duke and Vicky Carr. Flops, Part 2. After pages and pages celebrating wonderful examples of dramaturgical and musical genius, it's once again time to take a moment to honor these shows that, despite the blood, sweat, and tears of their creators and cast, resolutely stunk up the theater district, if they were lucky enough to make it into town. Or better yet, as a friend said after seeing Carrie, the king is dead, long live the queen. Karen Morrow, who could and should have been the merman of the 1960s and 70s, had what can only be called rotten luck. After a splash in the off-Broadway Sing Muse and the revival of The Boys from Syracuse, she made her Broadway debut as the leading lady from the Buddy Hackett vehicle I Had a Ball, 1964. Socking the title number out with such abandon and joy that her belt, akin to the most beautiful, glorious air braid siren you've ever heard, is still reverberating somewhere up in the rafters of the Alsherds Field. Some of her longest run were in 2 weeks stands at the New York City Center, playing the soubrette in the revivals of Carnival, Brigadoon, and The Most Happy Fella. After A Joyful Noise, 1966, and I'm Solomon, 1968, co-starring with fellow Jinx one Carmen Matthews, she spent time in California, supporting Jim Nabors on his short-lived variety show, returning to New York only to star in 2 more bombs. The Horace Harp, 1971, where she stopped the show in the middle with her tour de force Baby Love Miracle show, and The Selling of the President in 1972 with 5 performances in which Morrow didn't even sing. What were they thinking? She decamped permanently to Hollywood, occasionally appearing on television and in Los Angeles theater as a terrific Carlotta in Follies, Dolly Levi, and most recently a rock-solid Sally Adams in the reprise version of Call Me Madam. Only returning to New York in 1985 to replace Cleo Lane in The Mystery of Edwin Drood. She still sings like a dream. Oh, where is her show? Funny Face opened November 22nd, 1927, Alvin Theatre with 250 performances. Produced by Alex A. Aarons and Winton Freedley. Music by George Gershwin. Lyrics by Ira Gershwin. Book by Fred Thompson and Paul Gerard Smith. Musical director Alfred Newman. Stage by Edgar MacGregor. Choreographed by Bobby Connolly. Scenic design by John Wenger. Costume design by Kvyat. Synopsis. Jimmy Reeve is the caretaker of Frankie, her sister June, and a girl named Dora. Jimmy has taken Frankie's diary and locked it in his safe. Frankie is afraid of what he might find in the diary and arranges for her aviator boyfriend, Peter Thurston, to steal it. He does, but at the same time also manages to accidentally steal a valuable necklace belonging to June. The action hurdles around New York and New Jersey, finally coming to a close at the $2 million pier in Atlantic City. Cast: Dora, Betty Compton. June, Gertrude MacDonald. Frankie, Adele Astaire. Jimmy Reeve, Fred Astaire. Doug C. Gibbs, William Kent. Herbert, Victor Moore. Peter Thurston, Ellen Kearns. Duo pianist, Victor Arden Phil Ome. Here's a favorite parlor game of horrors called Hit or Flop. The moderator takes a random volume of Best Plays and reads a synopsis, and the players guess the fate of the show. Chiquita Heart, a nightclub entertainment. Harry Hart, a carnival pitchment, and Blossom Hart, a war worker, are found on the court of missing heirs and informed that they have inherited a ranch in Texas. Once there, they discover their property about Kelly Field and has been taken over by the army of maneuvers, which makes it nice for the boys when they invite their wives and girlfriends down. Then the army interferes. 2. Harvey Casey, big business tycoon, decides to send his rebellious daughter, Consuelo, to Potawatomi College at Stopgap, New Mexico. To guarantee her protection, he engages 4 former All-American football players to go along and, unknown to Consuelo, serve as her bodyguards of sorts. At Potawatomi, the football players get mixed up with the college 11 and Consuelo falls in love with one of them. The day of the big game, she discovers that she has been watched and orders the boys back east, compromise and kisses. 3. A singing, dancing romp in which a girl named Frankie induces Peter Thurston to help her steal back the pearls her guardian, Jimmy Reeve, has hidden from her. Dougsy and Herbert, comic regulars, are also after the pearls. Hits or flops? Answer: they were hits. Number 1 is Something for the Boys. Number 2 is Too Many Girls. And number 3 is, of course, Funny Face. What makes a hit musical? Betty Comden and Adolph Green, librettists and lyricists extraordinaire, felt that the music was more important than the lyrics. They reasoned that people went around humming the tunes, not singing the lyrics. Still, most experts feel that the most important factor in the show's success is the libretto. After all, there are lots of flop shows that feature great songs. Why did they fail? Because of a bad book. What else would explain the relative failure of the original production of Pal Joey? Not that it actually had a bad script, but the audiences at the time certainly thought it was. Though there were some exceptions, mainly the books written by Oscar Hammerstein, most early libretti were pretty damn silly. Since musical theater grew out of a variety of traditions, it has somewhat of a bastard art form in early days, with most shows built around established personalities from vaudeville and minstrel shows. From the latter came Al Jolson, arguably the greatest performer of all time. And the libretti for his shows were so inane, Jolson would actually stop the show, go down to the footlights, and ask the audience if they preferred to see a show or that was as written or just have Jolson present a concert of his hits. The hits always won. After a fashion, his tradition exists today, when Hugh Jackman, still in character as Peter Allen, stops the wafer-thin book of The Boy from Oz and speaks directly to the audience. Jackman is magnificent, a true Broadway star who can only do it all, and audiences eagerly await those times when he breaks the extremely fragile fourth wall. For its time, Funny Face libretto did its job admirably, loading the gentlest of plots with ample opportunities for Fred and Adele Astaire to show their stuff with terrific songs and imaginative choreography. It was all light-hearted fun, never promising more than it could deliver. Still, by 1927, the year Funny Face debuted, shows were already striving for a modicum of integration between song and story, and no longer were numbers listed as dance eccentrique and the cabaret as in Astaire's 1922 show, The Bunch and Judy. The books of these shows weren't a problem when they first produced. After all, you got Astaire's in the bargain. But when they are revived, the creakiness of the plots and the low comedy don't hold up without the original stars. So producers find the new book writers to update the scripts and make them more palatable to today's audience. Often, they all seem to do is add even more silly puns, then wink at the silliness of musical theater comedy in general. When new shows are created from old songs, like the recent Never Gonna Dance, the shows are neither old nor new, but rather trapped in some strange limbo uncomfortable in any era. Perhaps it's best to hear these great scores in concert, with minimal bridging narration. Better still would be a first-class revival, retaining the original book with just a little trimming. It would be fun to hear Funny Face with all those wonderful Gershwin standards, and well worth it to put up with a few creaks of the book. For these shows, like the classic silent films of Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and Buster Keaton, are part of our cultural heritage. We should have the opportunity every now and again to rediscover our musical comedy roots. Fred and Adele Astaire. More than just the leading dance team of the 1920s, the Astaires entertain audiences with their wit, charm, and sophistication, combined with unparalleled grace and technical virtuosity. The youngsters arrived in New York in 1904 when Fred was just 4 and Adele was 6. Mrs. Austerlitz, their mother, brought her offspring to the Great White Way so that they might become stars. They made their professional debut 2 years later in Keyport, New Jersey. They were booked of the Orpheum Circuit, touring in vaudeville until finally outgrowing their act. They made their Broadway debut in 1911 at a benefit performance at the Broadway Theater on 42nd Street. But their act, titled A Rainy Saturday, was such a failure no Broadway producer would touch them. Returning to the world of the two a day for the next 5 years, they got their first true Broadway booking in 1917 show Over the Top, which perfectly described the critical huzzas that greeted them. After that, there was no stopping them for the next 14 years, and they marauded through a succession of better and better shows, from Goodness Sake, Lady Be Good, Funny Face, and Smiles, culminating in a greatest review of Broadway history, The Bandwagon, 1931. Adele, deciding to go out on the top, marries Lord Charles Cavendish, leaving Fred a single act. The gamble paid off when he opened in Gay Divorce the next year, and once he proved he could do it alone, he too left the theater and made his way to Hollywood, where he became an even greater star, teaming most famously with Ginger Rogers. Alex Ahrens and Winton Freedley. Alex Ahrens and Winton Freedley created a remarkable series of shows at their eponymous Alvin Theatre that changed the history of musical theatre. The son of composer-producer Alfred E. Ahrens, Alex Ahrens made his Broadway debut in 1919, producing the George Gershwin B. G. De Silva show, La La Lucille. His next show, For Goodness Sake, boasted a score by George and Ira Gershwin, and in the cast was a young Winton Freedley, among others. Freedley, giving up his acting career, teamed with Ahrens as co-producer and had a hit right out of the gate, Lady Be Good, 1925. Thanks to its remarkable Gershwin score and the talent of the Astairs, they continued producing Gershwin shows, including Tiptoes, starring Keene Smith and Jeanette MacDonald, OK, with Gertrude Lawrence, and Funny Face. Rodgers and Hart got the Ahrens and Freedley treatment with Spring Is Here and Heads Up, both in 1929. After the stock market crash, Broadway business went south, but still the team struck gold with Girl Crazy in 1930. Their last co-production prior to Ahrens' retirement was the Gershwins' Pardon My English. Now producing solo, the dapper Freedley went on to present Cole Porter's Anything Goes, Red Hot Blue, and Leave It to Me, showing off Freedley's continued penchant for the exclamation point. After the hits Cabin in the Sky and Let's Face It, his last three offerings were failures. Freedley left Broadway for good in 1950. The team of Ahrens and Freedleys contributed much to Broadway, not the least of which was launching the careers of its two greatest female stars, Ethel Merman and Mary Martin. Backstage. The show tried out as Smarty with a book by Robert Benchley. It was a disaster. Mary Ellen Ashley, one of the little girls in the original cast of Annie Get Your Gun, reports that producers would top-load the cast for opening night. Once the production photos were taken and the show opened, the chorus numbers would be reduced. Funny Girl opened March 26 in 1964 at the Winton Garden Theatre, with 1,348 performances. Produced by Ray Stark, music by Joel Stein, lyrics by Bob Merrill, book by Isabel Leonard, music director Milton Rosenstock, music orchestrated by Ralph Burns, vocal arrangements by Buster Davis, dance arrangements by Luther Henderson, assistant vocal arranger Martin Hamlish, directed by Garson Kanin, production supervised by Jerome Robbins, musical staging by Carol Haney, scenic design by Robert Randolph and lighting design by Robert Randolph, and costume design by Irene Sharaf. Synopsis. Fanny Bryce, a bit of a misguite, yearns for a life on the stage. She finds work at the local Brooklyn theater. Eddie, the stage manager, stays up all night teaching her the routines. Before you know it, she's discovered by the Ziegfeld and becomes a star of his follies. Along the way, she meets the rakish and handsome gambler, Nicky Arnstein. They marry, but while Fanny's fortunes soar, Nick's luck runs out. He's jailed for stock swindling, and Fanny divorces him. But somehow she finds the strength to continue her life. Cast: Fanny Bryce, Barbara Streisand; Mrs. Bryce, Kay Medford; Mrs. Strakosch, Jane Stapleton; Tom Keeney, Joseph Macaulay; Eddie Ryan, Danny Meehan; Nick Arnstein, Sidney Chaplin; Florence Ziegfeld Jr., Roger DeKoven. Funny Girl was a troubled production from the beginning, so it's interesting that many consider it to be one of the best Broadway musicals. Without a star-making performance of Barbra Streisand as Fanny Bryce, Funny Girl might be best remembered as a great score married to a so-so libretto. The original idea for the show was that of Broadway producer Ray Stark, who just happened to be the real Fanny Bryce's son-in-law. Stark envisioned the piece as a film musical and hired Ben Hecht to write the screenplay. Fanny Bryce, very much alive at this time, thought his draft was a little fancy, but reasonably accurate by Hollywood standards. And the renewed interest in her career prompted Bryce to write her memoirs. When she died in 1951, just as the book was going to press, Stark bought the plates and put the book on hold. He approached several studios about a film version of Bryce's life, but was rebuffed by studio execs who recalled the previous, slightly disguised version of Bryce and gambler Nick Arnstein's relationship titled Rose of Washington Square. Stark got in touch with Isabel Leonard, a longtime Hollywood screenwriter who had written a screenplay titled My Men. He convinced her to redraft the work as a stage play, with the idea of opening the show on Broadway as a precursor to a movie version. It was a good idea, but it turned out that the execution wasn't quite so easy. Stark, having no experience on Broadway, knew that he needed a good producer and turned to David Merrick, who eagerly took on the project. Jules Stein, who had a recent success with another biomusical, Gypsy, agreed to write the music. Stein went to Stephen Sondheim, who came aboard to write the lyrics until Stark made a presentation to Mary Martin, and then a reigning queen of Broadway. Sondheim balked and dropped out of the project. Jerome Robbins was hired to direct and choreograph. Now, they all needed was a lyricist. Fortune intervened when Stein bumped into Bob Merrill, an old friend from his days of the Republic Pictures, and asked Merrill if he would write 5 songs on spec. They played the songs for a potential star, Anne Bancroft. She was aghast at the vocal range, predicting that no actress would ever be found to sing those songs. Stark and Merrick discussed the project with Carol Burnett, Shirley MacLaine, and Edie Gorm, who wanted Steve Lawrence to play Arnstein. Robbins got disgusted and left. Bob Fosse was hired next, but he, too, lost patience and quit. Finally, Garrison Cannon was signed as director. Stein then suggested that the team listen to Barbra Streisand, just beginning to make a name for herself. But Stark's wife, Bryce's daughter, Fran, was against Streisand, thinking she wasn't classy enough to play the sophisticated offstage Bryce. Just as things were looking up, Stark and Merrick had a falling out, and the real conflict arose when it was revealed that while Stark owned the property, Merrick owned Streisand's contract. As rehearsals progressed, the show was extensively reshaped, mostly to show Streisand to better advantage. Other performers had their parts cut down, and actress Ellen Ann McLeary lost her role entirely. Jerome Robbins was brought in to lend an unbiased eye and to help spark the show by tightening the pacing and adding fluid transitions between scenes. When it was suggested that Robbins and Cannon share directing credit, Cannon flatly rejected the idea, since he had been deeply involved in the show for 8 months. Ultimately, Robbins' credit read "Production supervised by Jerome Robbins," and an ego-bruised Cannon left the show. The constant tinkering resulted in the show's opening being postponed 5 times, but when it did open, it was a smash hit, due in large part to the score and, of course, Streisand's performance. Bob Merrill. Bob Merrill, composer and lyricist, began his career writing novelty songs such as "How Much Is That Doggy in the Window?" before auditioning a score for director George Abbott and producers Robert Griffin and Hal Prince, and winning his first Broadway show, New Girl in Town. After writing 2 David Merrick hits, Take Me Along and Carnival, he began bouncing back and forth between working as lyricist on such Julie Stein shows as Funny Girl and Sugar, and writing complete scores, Henry Sweet Henry. Despite the fact that 2 of his shows, Pretty Belle and The Prince of Grand Street, closed prior to Broadway, and another, the legendary Misfire Breakfast at Tiffany's, closed in previews, his output over the 20-year career was impressive, although cynics accused Merrill of being overly sentimental and musically simplistic. It was often reported that he composed his songs on a toy xylophone. Upon closer examination, this simply is not true. While his greatest songs as a composer, It's Good to Be Alive from New Girl in Town, Myra from Carnival, Here I Am from the half-great score Henry Sweet Henry, have an undeniable simplicity, full of joyful innocence. His lyrics to songs like You Are Woman from Funny Girl and On the Farm from Funny Girl reveal the verbal dexterity and bite of an artist in complete control of his craft. His last job, under the pseudonym Paul Stryker, was doctoring the lyrics for an old friend Joel Stein's last musical, The Red Shoes. Kay Medford, a talented character actress whose specialty was a Jewish mothers. Just to prove how talented an actress she was, her birth name was Maggie O'Regan. Made her debut in Paint Your Wagon before appearing in 2 revues, John Mary Anderson's Almanac and Almost Crazy. After replacing Pat Marshall in Mr. Wonderful and a City Center Carousel, she struck comic gold as Dick Van Dyke's mother in Bye Bye Birdie. Only 5 years older than Van Dyke, she was hilarious in her relentless attempt to break up her beloved Albert's relationship. Following a City Center revival of Pal Joey, in which she sang Zip opposite Bob Fosse, Medford landed her best and best-known role as Barbra Streisand's mother in Funny Girl, a role she reprised in the film version, albeit without her 2 big numbers, Who Taught Her Everything She Knows, pre-recorded but never filmed, and Finding Yourself a Man. She gave a brilliantly nuanced portrayal of Rosie Bryce, expressing her deep love for her daughter and real concerns subtly layered into her deadpan skepticism. Medford was not nearly as lucky with straight plays, with the exception of A Hole in the Head in 1957, and Woody Allen's Don't Drink the Water, which she left early to film Funny Girl. She appeared in 6 Broadway plays that ran less than a month each. Backstage. Joel Stein named his son Nick after the character Nicky Arnstein. Robbins, Fosse, and Kanan all wanted people got from the score. A funny thing happened on the way to the Forum, opened on May 8, 1962 at the Alvin Theatre with 964 performances. Produced by Harold Prince, music and lyrics by Stephen Sondheim, book by Bert Shevelove and Larry Gelbart, music orchestrated by Irvin Kostal and Sid Wemmen, musical director Harold Hastings, dance arrangements by Hal Schaefer, additional dance music by Betty Wahlberg, directed by George Abbott, choreographed by Jack Cole, additional staging and choreography by Jerome Robbins, scenic design by Tony Walton and costume design by Tony Walton, lighting design by Jane Rosenthal. Synopsis. This is a farce, so pay particularly close attention. Pseudolus, a slave in the house of Xenex, will do particularly anything. No, that makes absolutely anything to gain his freedom. Xenex's son, Hero, what else, is just discovering girls and falls in love with Philia, the girl next door. The problem is, the girl next door is a virgin and a courtesan owned by Marcus Lycus. Hero promises Pseudolus his freedom if he arranges a meeting between Philia and him. Second catch. Roman soldier extraordinaire Miles Glorious is on his way to retrieve Philia, who he has purchased as a mail order bride. When Miles Gloriosus arrives to pick up his purchase, he at the will call window of the house of Marcus Lycus, Pseudolus tells him that Philia has died from the plague and show Miles her body, only it's really his friend Hysterium, an extremely nervous slave in a shroud. Miles demands a funeral pyre and, well, by the end, Hero and Philia are united. Miles and Philia discover that they are siblings and the lost children of Erroneus, who has searched the world for his offspring, and Pseudolus gains his freedom. Cast. Prologus or Pseudolus, Zero Mostel. Xenex, David Burns. Domina, Ruth Cowbird. Hero, Brian Davies. Hysterium, Jack Guilford. Lucas, John Carradine. Philia, Pressy Marker. Erroneous, Raymond Walburn. Miles Gloriosus, Ronald Holgate. Is there a doctor in the house? It's an oft asked question, especially for shows experiencing difficulties in tryouts. And the doctor most producers and directors turned to was director and choreographer Jerome Robbins. The list of musicals he directed and choreographed is remarkable, and even a partial list of all musicals doctored is impressive. Funny Girl, Silk Stockings, Wonderful Town, Wish You Were Here, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and Cabaret for starters. A funny thing happened on the way to the forum. He also had a hand in some flops, including Seventh Heaven, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and Ankles Away. A funny thing happened on the way to the forum was a smash hit in its gypsy run through prior to going on the road. But when it opened in New Haven, its reception was lackluster. Not bad, but not especially good either. One problem was that the author had been convinced to simplify the plot, so they quickly started putting the complications back in. The original ingenue and juvenile were recast. The show moved to DC, and as Harold Prince tells it, over half of the audience left the theater before the final curtain call rang down. The original opening was a gentle little song titled Love is in the Air, sung by David Burns, one of the supporting leads. Stephen Sondheim had realized that Love is in the Air gave the wrong signal, and he wrote the song Invocation, but Abbott rejected it as not hummable. Prince knew that something was wrong but didn't quite know how to fix the problem, so he called in Jerome Robbins. Robbins had originally agreed to direct A Funny Thing Happened, but dropped out when he decided that the material wasn't ready and that the producer, David Merrick, was too difficult. Once Merrick was out of the picture, Robbins came back in, only to withdraw for a second time. Larry Gelbart had sent Robbins a telegram reading in the part, Your cowardly withdrawal is